I wasn't riding for anyone that night. Just a lantern hung low from the saddle horn, a slow horse with old opinions, in the kind of wind that walks the canyon like it's memorizing sorrow. Folks say a man chooses his roads. Truth is, out here the roads choose, and sometimes they put you right where loss is waiting. Dressed like happenstance, the desert was cooling from a day that had baked the iron out of rocks. Heat leaked off the ribs of the land in soft breaths. I kept to the shadowed side of the ridge, letting the mesquite comb its thorns across my chaps and boot heels, listening to the little sounds that decide a life. There's a hush just before things go wrong, and I'd known it since the war. It is not silence, not exactly. It's the world tucking in its shirt, getting presentable for whatever harm is about to arrive. When I heard the cry, it didn't belong to coyotes, and it didn't belong to the wind. It came up out of Rattlesnake Canyon like a wounded prayer, thin and stubborn. I rained down without thinking, the way you pull your hand away from a stove long after the burn is healed. The horse lifted his head, ears tilting. I patted his neck. There's a weight to mercy same as to iron. You can feel it climb the reins. I've never been much for talking, and I don't romanticize heroics. Men like me don't save the world. On a good day, we keep it from sinking a finger lower. But the cry climbed again and curled around the lantern light. And before I knew it, I turned down the shale, letting the slope do its work, boot soles scraping, the horse dancing sideways with that patient disgust horses feel for human decisions. The canyon keeps its own time. Down there, twilight stretches longer, and shadows learn to pretend they're walls. I smelled damp stone and creosote, and the old copper coin smell of fear. It sits high in the nose, like the memory of blood. I swung out of the saddle and let the lantern show me what it could. The beam went a little way, then broke its ankle on the rock. That was when I saw her. She was wedged on a ledge, halfway between ground and sky, dress torn, hair stuck to her cheeks with dust and sweat. One shoe was missing. The other was holding on like pride. She had the look of someone who has fallen through darkness long enough to name each shade. When the light touched her, she didn't flinch. She studied me like a question. "You ain't dying out here, ma'am," I said. I say it plain, because words don't do much in a canyon. They're too proud for echo, and pride won't climb. I lashed the lantern to a pinon root and went down to her, testing each foothold like it owed me money. When I reached her, the ledge sighed under our weight. She was lighter than the fear that held her. Her hands were scraped raw, skin raised in little moons. I told her my name, not because it would matter, but because it felt like setting a stake in soil that might slide. "Ethan Ellis." She said hers with a voice that looked toward the east. "Lillian." It came out careful, like it had been broken once and glued back together. I put her hands on my shoulders and felt the tremor of effort run through both of us. We climbed, slow as forgiveness. When we topped out, the horse looked at us like we'd made his night longer on purpose. I carried her across the last stretch, her cheek to my shirt, the lantern throwing our shadows long and ugly against the wall. Shadows tell the truth cruelly, but they don't lie. Up at the rim, wind had teeth again. I wrapped her in a blanket from the saddle roll and set her on a flat rock that had seen 100 such nights and kept its opinion. She kept her eyes on the lantern, like warmth could be learned by study. I poured coffee from the tins and warned it was bitter. She sipped as if bitterness was a favor. Sometimes it is. I was traveling to take a post, she said after a while. Teaching, east to west. Thought the land might want letters. The words were steady. The space between them was not. Men rode up. I don't know their names. They didn't require mine. Something in my ribs did a slow turn, like a wheel with a broken spoke. I have known men who wear courage like a buckle, and men who carry it where the prayer bone sits behind the breast. I have also known the other kind. They keep the world loud. The war had used many of them up, but not all. Some survived like weeds, saying the soil invited them. "Can you ride?" I asked. She nodded, then looked at her stockinged foot like nodding might have been a lie. I tore a strip from the blanket and bound it around the bootless one. She watched me do it, and her eyes were the color of old ponds that hold a sky too big for their borders. I cinched it and got her up. The horse allowed her weight out of politeness. We took the slow trail along the north face, where stone keeps the day's heat like a memory it's not ready to forgive. I led the horse and let the night choose our pace. Crickets wrote their small sermons. An owl lifted off a stub cedar like a secret that had waited long enough. The lantern swung, cut a moving door in the dark, and we went through that door again and again until the idea of doors felt unnecessary. The line camp sat where the land leveled and thought about kindness. A 2-bunk shack, a stove that rattled when it cooled, a barrel of water with a clean taste of wood. I got the fire going, set the coffin near, and found her some bread and beans. She ate the way hunger prays without posture. When she finished, she folded her hands in her lap like she was at church and I was the sermon. I am not a sermon. I am a man with dust in his hatband and a ledger of losses I keep mostly balanced. "You got folks anywhere close?" I asked. She shook her head. Boston was the nearest anchor, and anchors don't hold out here. I told her we'd ride at first light to the main ranch. The Harrington place has fences that stand upright, and the sort of woman who knows how to make fear sit on the porch like a dog and wait. She nodded. The nod meant trust. Out here you learn that trust is not faith or ignorance. It's the exhausted agreement between your heart and the evidence. She lay on the bunk and turned toward the wall. I took the chair beside the stove and let the night gather around us. The desert knows how to sit still. It can do it for years. Men pretend they invented stillness. We did not. We only borrow it and return it scuffed. I watched the flames think their way down to coal. A man could get lost in watching fire, and I have many nights. Long enough to see faces I'd buried lean out of it. Long enough to hear their voices say nothing I can use. The war took things from me I had not offered, then asked me to be grateful for what it left. It left me good at quiet. It left me with a horse that understood resignation. It left me the kind of hunger you can feed by riding into the dark without waiting for an invitation. Toward dawn, just as the stove learned to cool, she spoke into the room. Not to me exactly, but to the place where my listening sat. "Thank you," she said. It was the first soft thing the night had given. I tipped my hat in the dark. I don't believe in making kindness large, but I believe in not stepping on it. We rode at sunrise. The light came slow through a gauze of dust, painting things kind first, then honest. She sat the saddle like the idea was new but worthy. Every now and then she winced when the horse found a roughness in the trail. She didn't mention it. I didn't either. That's the language we speak out here. We talk about the sky when we mean pain. We discuss the shape of a cloud when we mean hope. Past the dry wash, the land opened like a book you've already read and still trust. Cottonwoods took up more sky than their roots could justify. Calves bawled the way young do in complaint and pure life. I felt something loosen between my shoulders, a knot that had become part of my name. Maybe it was the sound of a day that intended no harm. Maybe it was the way her hands learned the reins and forgot to be afraid of anything that moved. At the lip of the long meadow, the ranch came into view. Fences and straight sentences, a windmill turning its one thought over and over into water. Smoke from the kitchen leaned west like it knew who it was. I felt the horse collect himself, as if he meant to step into a story with better grammar. I touched the brim of my hat, a habit I have when I enter places where gentleness lives. It is a small apology for the dust I bring. Almost there, I said. She nodded, and I saw color come back to her. Not on the skin so much as behind it, where the person keeps their truest map. I found I was breathing in measure with the horse, with the wind, with that kitchen smoke that promised bacon, and a voice that could make a room feel held. I have learned not to ask for much, but I have also learned the West. He has a way of handing a man something he did not dare request, wrapped in burlap and offered without ceremony. We rode on. The lantern, empty now, tapped the saddle with a sound that remembered night, but did not mourn it. I did not know then what the day would make of us. I only knew that I had heard a cry that was not the wind and answered it, and in the answering found a thin seam of peace running through the ore of trouble. A man can live on such seams for a long time if he rides careful and keeps the fire low. When we reached the gate, I swung down and opened it, and the hinges didn't complain. That felt like a good sign. The horse walked through with the patience of someone who has forgiven everything worth forgiving. I closed the gate behind us and looked at the house, at the fields beyond, at the mirage blur of the far hills. I felt the kind of tired a man trusts, the kind that means he is pointed right. "Welcome home for now," I said. It wasn't a promise. Out here, promises are a kind of weather. They pass, but it was something. And sometimes something is the only honest coin we have. I led her toward the porch, where the day waited to see if we meant to stay. Thomas Harrington met us at the porch with a dish towel over one shoulder and the calm a man earns by outwaiting droughts. He was wide in the chest from work and narrow in his judgments. His eyes took in the torn dress, the binding on her foot, the emptiness that rides a person after terror has spent itself. He did not waste time asking for a story before offering us a chair. "Coffee's on," he said. "Margaret's got biscuits cooling. You look like you need both," and a little silence. There are doorways where a man chooses whether to carry the night inside with him or leave it folded on the rail. I tried to set the worst of it there beside the honeysuckle. It did not want to stay, but the smell of yeast and bacon and clean floors has its own persuasion. We followed Thomas into a kitchen that understood what mornings are for. The stove heat touched the bones in my hands and reminded them of young days. Margaret turned from the counter with a look that found the hurt and didn't flinch. "Sit, honey," she told Lillian, her voice the temperature of mercy. "We will see to that foot proper." Lillian sat without making a fuss of it, and I watched both women decide what dignity meant in that minute. "Margaret, set a basin on the table, and worked with the care you save for quilts and babies and broken strangers. She cleaned the scrapes with warm water, not talk. When pain lifted Lillian's breath, Margaret said a small sentence to distract it. The sentences were about chickens and the windmill and the new calf that had been born with a comet of white down its nose. The sentences did what they were meant to do. They made a fabric around the rawness so it could be carried. Thomas handed me a plate, heavy with food, and a cup of coffee darker than a courtroom. I ate standing at the window, looking out at the yard. A couple of ranch hands were fixing a rail, speaking with the kind of economy men use when they understand both wood and each other. Beyond the fence, the meadow lay in a green that would not last, ringed by cottonwoods black against the rising glare. There are mornings when the world says yes without asking what you want. This felt like one. When Margaret had wrapped the foot with clean cotton in a calm knot, she tied an old boot over the bandage and declared it serviceable. Lillian thanked her and tried something like a smile. It was pale, but upright. Margaret looked at me as if there were a question only I could hear. "We will need to tell someone," I said. "Men threw her into the canyon. That is not a thing you let walk away." Thomas set his cup down with care. "Judge in town is a friend of men who pay his whiskey bill. Sheriff does what keeps windows unbroken, but the marshal rides through next week. If a message went by wire, maybe sooner." I nodded. I have learned to choose the road that carries law, even when it has holes. I washed at the pump, scrubbed the dust off my hands, and thought about the oath I never took but kept anyway. There are oaths a man carries the way he carries his name. No paper needed, only the steady habit of it. We put Lillian in the back bedroom for rest, the one with lace curtains Margaret insisted on, because men whose hands can set a bone still benefit from something soft moving in the breeze. I stood in the doorway a long moment, watching sleep touch her face like a careful aunt. She had done her best not to cry in front of us. I respected that and wished it weren't necessary. When the breathing settled into the honest rhythm of exhaustion, I stepped out and let the door take its time closing. Thomas and I saddled fresh horses and rode to the telegraph office in town. 10 miles of dust that had opinions about everything. The road kept company with a dry creek bed part of the way, where sycamores muscled their roots into the kind of thirst that writes scripture. We did not speak much. Men who have ridden together through hard things learn the value of hearing the land think. Town held itself like it had been assembled quickly and never quite apologized. False fronts wore their pride like stiff collars. Boys ran with sticks that pretended to be rifles, and women kept their eyes forward the way women do when the world has practiced being unkind. The telegraph operator was a nervous man with fingers that could coax meaning out of lightning, but went shaky when anyone raised a voice. I put money on the counter and handed over a message addressed to the territorial marshal 3 towns east. Names, time, what had been done, what we were prepared to swear. The operator read it and swallowed. Like the words had bones, he sent it on in dots and dashes that made the air speak in the next room. On the ride back, heat came up hard. The horses lost interest in opinions. A hawk made a long circle over a patch of rabbit brush and decided against it. Thomas squinted against the glare and said a thing that did not require answer. Men who do a deed like that rarely stop at one. I knew he was right. The kind of men who throw a woman into a canyon do not believe the world will ask them to account. They keep a private book where cruelty is a profit and fear is a coin. You cannot audit such a ledger with preaching. You audit it with daylight and witnesses, and if it comes to it, iron. Back at the ranch, the afternoon leaned toward thunder without the promise of rain. I found Margaret on the porch shelling peas, her apron green with work. Lillian was awake, sitting beside her with a glass of water catching the light in a way that made it look braver than it was. She asked me if the wire had gone. I said it had. She looked at the line of hills as if weighing whether an answer could cross them. "You can stay here," Margaret told her, like she was granting permission to a season. "No one will trouble you while you mend." I took a book from the shelf inside and brought it out to the porch. It was a reader for children, letters marching in tidy formations, small stories about boys who feed the dog and girls who mind the pie. Lillian smiled at it with a kind of ache. "I can put your hands to other work," I said softly, not wanting to jostle the bruise the world had put in her. "Ledger in the barn is behind by 2 weeks, if numbers behave for you." "Numbers behave for me," she said, and the words carried a little of Boston's clean lines. We set her up at the end of the long table in the barn where light falls straight from the loft door. Dust hung there like a congregation of doubts receiving instruction. She bent over the book with a pencil sharp enough to ask its questions without apology. I breathed easier, watching her order cattle tallies and seed receipts, watching her make sense where there had been only the honest chaos of work. Sometimes the first step away from terror is measuring a thing that can be measured. When evening came, the way it always does, with the sun considering whether it had earned its rest, we ate at the long table with the hands. No one asked her for a story. Ranches are good places for letting a person keep their share of silence. The men spoke about fence lines and a wolf sighted north of the draw. Laughter came now and then, not loud, but in a shape that lets the hurt sit without feeling challenged. After supper, I walked the perimeter, habit more than worry, though worry moved in behind it like a shadow that has learned to anticipate. The first stars tested the eastern sky. A breeze found the cottonwoods and turned them into a quiet choir. I let the night enter me that far, and no farther. On the backstretch, where the fence dips for a shallow bend, I saw prints that had not been there at noon. 3 horses, shoes in good repair. The direction did not say friendly. I crouched and read what the ground would give. They had sat for a time, taken a long look, then moved on toward the road. A man who lives by signs learns the difference between curiosity and inventory. This had the feel of men counting what was not theirs yet. I went back to the house and told Thomas what I had seen. He nodded. We set 2 watches for the night. Nothing showy. A lantern in the south window that would look like carelessness, and a rifle where carelessness could reach for it without finding. The hands knew the drill. We did not tell Margaret the particulars. She knew anyway. Women who keep houses safe can hear the shape of danger by how men's stories shrink to fit a room. Before first watch, I stepped onto the porch and found Lillian in the rocker. A shawl around her shoulders, her bandaged foot lifted onto a stool like a small white flag. She looked at the yard with the expression of someone reteaching herself a country. "You should sleep," I said. "So should you," she answered. I took the rail and leaned into it. The wood remembered 1,000 elbows. The night remembered our kind. We did not speak for a while. When she finally did, her voice had learned a notch of steadiness no medicine sells. "I do not know what sort of man you are, Mr. Ellis. I only know you rode toward a cry. If I never learn another true thing, that will do." I wanted to say that men are collections of days, and the day you meet us is always claiming more than its share of credit. I wanted to tell her that I had ridden away from a great many cries as well, because a man is not a story, and stories tidy what they should not. Instead, I said the only thing that felt colored the right shade for the hour. "You are safe here." It was not a vow. It was a posture. I have found posture holds longer than vows, and it breaks quieter when it must. She nodded and watched the sky collect stars like a rancher counts calves after a storm. I took my rifle and went to find my patch of dark. The night opened to let me in, and the land did what the land always does when humans grow small and honest upon it. It listened. The next morning broke gray, the kind of color that doesn't commit to day, yet doesn't honor night. I've been awake long before the rooster, watching the lantern flame tremble in its glass, thinking about those hoof prints by the southern fence. There's a rhythm a man learns after enough years in the saddle. Sleep light, breathe slow, listen for the one sound that doesn't belong. Margaret moved about the kitchen, her apron whispering against the table's edge. She hummed an old tune, something about a river that carries both sin and salvation in its current. The smell of cornmeal and bacon eased through the house like forgiveness. When I stepped outside, dew hung to the sage like a promise no one had yet kept. The world was damp, muted, waiting for the sun to decide whether to show mercy. I found Thomas already by the corral, checking the latch on the feed gate. He nodded without words, and we shared the kind of quiet that exists between men who have long agreed on what matters and what doesn't. We rode the perimeter again, slow and deliberate. The tracks from the night before were faded, but not erased. 3 horses, one lighter than the others, judging by the depth of print. They'd stopped near the north line, too, close enough to study the ranch layout. I didn't need to say what that meant. Thomas saw it the same way I did. Trouble was marking its map. When we got back, Lillian was standing on the porch, balanced careful on her bandaged foot. She borrowed one of Margaret's shawls, blue faded soft from years of washings. The morning light caught in her hair, turning dust to something finer. She looked steadier, though her hands twisted the edge of that shawl like they were still talking with fear. "You should be resting," I told her. She smiled, a small thing, quick to vanish. "Resting doesn't feel like life," she said. "Not anymore." There was something in her tone, tired but learning its own courage, that made me look at her longer than courtesy allows. Out here a man notices when someone tries to stand again, same way he notices the first blade of green after fire. Breakfast was plain, biscuits, coffee, beans, but no one wanted more. Afterward, Lillian asked to walk a bit. Margaret fussed, but gave way. I saddled the gentlest mare, a sorrel named Junie, and led them both down to the creek that carved its thin song through the pasture. The sun finally showed itself, pale gold, slipping over the ridge like a shy hand. We walked along the water's edge. Birds chased each other through the willows. The land smelled of damp soil and the first warm promise of the day. Lillian stopped by a fallen log and watched the water move. "I used to think I understood the world," she said quietly. "Classrooms, books, lessons about right and wrong. But the West doesn't care for tidy answers." "No," I said. "Out here truth's just what survives the wind." She looked at me then straight, eyes clear in the morning light. "And you, Mr. Ellis, what survived your wind?" I could have given her the polite version. The war, the graves, the long trails that took more than they gave. But the question sat deeper than that, and something in her patience asked for honesty, not comfort. "I used to think solitude was peace," I said. "Turns out it's just quiet with a cost. You pay for it in little pieces of yourself you don't get back." She didn't answer right away, only traced a circle in the dirt with her good foot. The air between us felt heavy but clean, like rain before it breaks. When we turned back, the wind had picked up, teasing the grass into waves. From the porch, we saw Thomas and one of the hands tightening saddle cinches, readying to ride into town for supplies. He caught my eye and gave a small nod. He'd seen what he needed, that the woman who'd fallen into a canyon was now upright and breathing free air. The afternoon passed lazy, heat settling into every board of the house. I repaired a section of fence that had grown weary, hammer echoing across the pasture. Lillian brought me water and stood a while under the cottonwood shade, watching the rhythm of the work. "Does the land ever stop testing you?" she asked. "No," I said, driving another nail. "But sometimes it forgives you for not being strong enough." She seemed to turn that over, and for a heartbeat, her expression softened. Then Margaret's voice called her back to the house, and I was alone with the wind again. By sundown, clouds were stacking over the far hills, bruised purple and gray. I could smell rain that hadn't yet chosen its direction. Margaret gathered the chickens, Thomas stowed the tack. Lillian lingered on the porch rail, eyes on the horizon where the sky was folding itself into darker cloth. "Storm's coming," I said. She nodded, though I wasn't sure she'd heard me. The wind lifted her hair across her cheek, and she didn't brush it away. That night, the storm broke wide. Thunder rolled across the valley like old anger, rain coming sideways, hard enough to rattle nails. The roof held, but only just. Lightning flickered in through the shutters, wide and brief, showing everything too clearly. I checked the horses, then the barn doors, then the rifle leaning against my bunk. Habit, not fear. The kind of habit that keeps a man from leaving things to chance. When I came back in, Lillian was at the window, shawl wrapped tight. She turned as the lightning flared behind her, and for a second she looked both fragile and unyielding, like the land itself. "It sounds alive," she whispered. "It is," I said. "The land's got a temper, same as people. Only difference is it tells you honest when it's mad." We sat at the table with the lamp turned low. Rain played its song on the roof, a rhythm older than anything I'd ever prayed for. She asked about the war then, gentle, as if pulling a splinter she didn't mean to hurt. I told her pieces about the cold, the sound of men dying quiet, the weight that never lifts once you've seen what hate can make of a human face. I didn't give her names. The dead prefer to keep what's left of their privacy. When I finished, she said nothing, just reached across the table and set her hand on mine, not to comfort, but to share the silence. Her fingers were small, rough from travel, warm, the kind of touch that doesn't ask permission, because it isn't about want. It's about understanding something wordless. We stayed like that a long time, until the thunder walked off into the hills. The lamp hissed softly, its flame sinking low. Outside, the rain slowed to a whisper. I looked at her and thought about how strange it is, the way a life can turn on the sound of a single cry in the dark. How a man can ride out one night to ease someone else's fear and find himself carrying a lighter kind of burden back. When she finally stood, she said goodnight, voice low, almost shy. The word hung in the room like smoke. I sat a while longer after she was gone, staring at the empty cup between my hands, feeling the quiet settle. That night, I dreamed of the canyon again. Only this time, when I reached for her, the light didn't falter. The next few days slid by slow, like the river after rain. The ground stayed soft, and the air held that clean scent of washed dust. Out here we learned to take calm as a kind of grace. It doesn't last long, but it's real while it does. Lillian settled into the rhythm of the ranch, the way sunrise settles into the plains. Quiet, but sure. She helped Margaret with the morning bread, learned how to pour coffee without spilling during a stampede of laughter, and even coaxed a few words out of the shyest ranch hand we had, young Ben Carter. Her foot healed slower than her spirit, but both made progress you could measure if you watched close enough. I spent my hours out along the southern fence line, pretending it was duty when maybe it was avoidance. A man can get used to peace the way a wild horse gets used to the halter, uneasy at first, then reluctant to admit he's grateful for it. The sun burned steady, the smell of mesquite mixed with horse sweat and iron nails. Each swing of the hammer was a conversation with myself. I didn't need to finish. By evening, I'd ride back and see her on the porch, reading by the last of the light. She had a book from Margaret's shelf. Sermons, I think, or Emerson, maybe both. Her lips moved faintly as she read, and sometimes she smiled at a line only she could hear. That smile had a way of pulling the day's weight off my shoulders without asking. On the fourth night after the storm, we all sat outside to watch the sunset. The sky stretched wide, turning red, then violet, then that soft, fading gray the west wears before sleep. Crickets started their arguments early. Thomas smoked his pipe, the smell of it blending with the evening air. Margaret asked Lillian about her family back east, and she spoke of a mother who wrote letters with neat script and little patience, a father who'd believed education was a kind of armor, and a brother who'd headed north for factory work and never wrote again. She said it all with a calm that told me those ties were already ghosts she'd made her peace with. When she finished, Thomas nodded, like a man saluting something noble but lost. Out here, Ma, he said, the past rides behind us, but it never quits following. She looked to me then. And yours, Mr. Ellis? Does it still follow? I thought of battlefields, of graves that had no wood left for markers, of a letter I'd once written to no one, because the person who needed to read it had no address but the ground. I drew a long breath. Some nights I hear it catching up. Other nights I let it. No one said anything after that. We watched the last of the light drain from the rim of the world, each of us thinking about something we'd buried that still breathed. Later, after the others turned in, I lingered on the porch. The moon rose slow, fat and yellow, the kind that makes every shadow honest. I heard the soft creak of a door and saw Lillian step out, shawl around her shoulders. She moved to the rail beside me, the boards sighing under her weight. "I can't sleep," she said. "The quiet's too loud." I smiled a little. "Takes time. The desert hums even when you think it's still. You just gotta learn its language." "What does it say to you?" I looked out across the fields. "Says keep going. Says every mistake gets a sunrise if you're patient enough to see it." She folded her arms, eyes tracing the dark hills. "And when you can see it, then you ride toward where it should be," I said. "Sometimes faith is just guessing right." For a while we stood there, neither talking. The night smelled of sage and cooling earth. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote called, long and mournful. She shivered, but not from cold. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked finally. I knew what she meant. The men from the canyon. Evil like that doesn't tire easy. I've been scanning the ridges every morning since. "They might," I said. "Men like that don't forget what they've done. They only try to finish it." She turned toward me. "And you? Why did you come that night?" There it was. The question she hadn't asked before. I thought about lying, saying I was just passing through. But something in her voice deserved better. "I heard you," I said simply. "And I've been waiting a long time to hear something that wasn't my own silence." Her gaze held mine a second longer than it should have, long enough for me to notice the reflection of the lantern in her eyes. Two small fires that refused to go out. She nodded once, then turned back to the dark. "Then maybe both of us were found," she whispered. After she went inside, I stayed. The night pressed close, the way it does when it wants to listen. I let the quiet stretch, thought about her words, and realized something I hadn't dared before, that maybe the world still had room for beginnings, even for men who long outlived theirs. When I finally went in, the coals in the stove were almost gone, but their glow was enough to light the floorboards. I paused by her door. No sound, just the soft rhythm of breathing, steady and real. I let that sound follow me back to my bunk. Sleep didn't come quick, but when it did, it came gentle, the kind that doesn't hide its mercy. Morning came with a pale hush, the kind that makes a man feel older than his years. The wind carried a cool edge, rolling down from the mountains like a memory. The ranch was quiet, except for the low murmur of cattle and the rhythmic clang of the windmill pump. I saddled my horse before breakfast, not because there was work that couldn't wait, but because some rides are just a way to think without admitting it. I followed the creek north, where it narrowed and cut deep into rock. The light spilled across the canyon in long gold strokes, waking up everything slow. The air still smelled of the storm days before, wet sage, iron, and new beginnings. I rode until the ranch shrank behind me, and the only sound left was the horse's breathing and the soft scrape of hooves against sand. There's a point out here where the land opens so wide a man can hear himself again. Sometimes that's comfort, sometimes not. I stopped on a rise, looking down at the trail that wound between the cliffs. That's where I'd found her. Even now, the canyon held a kind of echo, like it remembered the fear it had swallowed. I dismounted, looped the reins over a low branch, and stood there for a long while. I don't pray much. The war took that habit and replaced it with something quieter. Not faith, just acknowledgement. But standing there, I took off my hat and let the wind pass through my hair like absolution. Maybe it's enough sometimes to just tell the world you're still here. I headed back around noon. The sky had that bright, merciless look the West wears when it's thinking about testing you again. Dust trailed behind me like a thought I couldn't shake. When I rode up, Lillian was in the yard, hanging linens, sunlight turning the white cloth into bright sails. She looked up as I passed through the gate, shading her eyes. "You were gone long," she said. "Just checking the north fence," I lied gently. She nodded, but her smile said she knew the truth and didn't hold it against me. "It's a good day to write you, Mama," she said. "A good day to start over." That word, start, hit something deep. Out here, every sunrise gives you that chance, but most men are too tired to take it. Maybe she wasn't. Maybe I wasn't either, though I've been pretending otherwise. After lunch, I worked with Thomas on repairing a water trough near the east pasture. He told me the marshal had wired back. They'd received my message and were coming through in 3 days' time. Relief and dread walked through me at the same pace. Justice is a fine thing until it arrives, carrying the faces you hope never to see again. That evening, as the sun settled low, Lillian brought supper out to the porch. Beans, cornbread, and strong coffee. Simple, honest food. We ate side by side, the table between us crowded with silence that wasn't heavy, just full. The cicadas had begun their song, that endless drone that feels like time stretching out forever. Afterward, she spoke, eyes on the horizon. "Do you ever think about leaving, Ethan, starting somewhere new?" I took a slow breath, weighing the question. "Thought about it plenty," I said. "Every time I do, I realize I just carry myself with me. Distance don't fix what lives inside a man." She nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "Maybe it's not about leaving," she said softly. "Maybe it's about letting something new stay." That line stayed with me long after she'd gone in. I sat on the porch until the stars came out, trying to remember the last time I let anything stay. Most things in my life had been temporary: a tent, a bunk, a passing friend, a borrowed horse, even peace. Sometime after midnight, the dogs started barking. Not the casual kind. This was sharp, urgent. I was on my feet before I knew it, rifle in hand. Thomas met me at the door, already pulling on his coat. From the yard came the quick thud of hooves, then voices low but angry. The kind of talk men do when they think decency can't hear them. Lillian appeared in the hallway, pale in the lantern light. "Stay inside," I said. She opened her mouth, maybe to argue, but then she saw something in my face and nodded. Margaret drew her back into the kitchen, whispering prayers I couldn't make out. Thomas and I stepped out into the night. The moon was high but thin, its light broken by clouds. 4 riders had gathered near the front gate, their shapes black against the pale dust. I recognized the lead one the moment he spoke. "Well now," he called, voice slick with mockery, "if it ain't Ethan Ellis, the preacher of the plains. Heard you been a-hiding our business up here." Tanner. Of course. The man's reputation rode ahead of him in every county. Rustler, liar, killer when it suited him. His brother Wallace sat a few paces back, hand resting lazy on his revolver, smile all wrong. "I ain't hiding anything that belongs to you," I said. He laughed. "You got a woman in there says otherwise." Thomas shifted beside me, slow, like a storm about to choose direction. "You best turn around, Tanner," he said. "No good comes from finishing what you started." Tanner spat in the dust. "Good don't interest me much. Justice does. the kind a man makes for himself. The word justice twisted in his mouth until it meant revenge. I could see where this was going. I raised my rifle, not aiming yet. You step one hoof closer to that porch, and you'll learn what kind of justice this land still respects. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Even the night seemed to lean in. Then one of his men shifted in the saddle, hand twitching toward his belt. It was enough. The shot cracked the dark wide open. Horses reared, Thomas shouted, and everything turned to noise and light and gunpowder. I remember firing twice, the recoil driving into my shoulder like memory. I saw Wallace fall, clutching at air. Tanner cursed, ducking low, his shot whistling past my ear, close enough to singe the night. Then the sudden quiet, the kind that follows only when both sides are too busy bleeding or counting what's left. Tanner's men dragged his brother onto a horse, retreating into the dark. I didn't chase. Out here, revenge is just another kind of storm. It always circles back on its own. When I turned, Lillian stood in the doorway, lantern shaking in her hands. She looked at me as though she couldn't decide whether to be afraid or grateful. I had no answer for either. Thomas went to check the trail while Margaret pulled Lillian inside. I followed last, closing the door gentle. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the knowledge that trouble rarely ends where it begins. Later, alone at the table, I cleaned my rifle. The smell of oil and smoke thick in the air. Through the window, the lantern light touched her silhouette as she sat in the next room, head bowed, hands clasped tight. I thought about telling her it was over, but it wasn't, and both of us knew it. Out here, peace never stays without asking for a price, and by the sound of the wind against the eaves, I reckoned the bill was already on its way. Dawn came light, wearing the bruises of what the night had done. The air was thick with the smell of spent powder and rain that hadn't fallen. The world outside the windows was gray, uneasy, like it was holding its breath. Thomas had been out since first light, tracking the riders. He came back with dust on his coat and worry hiding behind his calm. Tanner was alive. Wallace wasn't. That meant the man had one more reason to come back. Not for Lillian, not for justice, but for vengeance wrapped in pride. And pride, I've learned, will kill a man faster than any bullet if you let it. Inside, the house was quiet. Lillian sat at the table, a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands. Margaret moved around her like a mother hen, pretending chores could hold fear at bay. I poured a cup for myself, sat across from her, and waited. She finally looked up, her eyes still wide from the memory of gunfire. He'll come back, won't he? Men like Tanner always do, I said, but we'll be ready. I don't want anyone else hurt because of me. I shook my head. Ain't your fault the world's got wolves, but we can sure as hell decide how close they get to the door. That earned me the faintest smile, a tired thing, but real. By noon, the marshal rode in. He was a tall man with the look of someone who'd buried too many friends to enjoy introductions. 2 deputies followed, faces grim but steady. I told him everything, from the canyon to the gunfire, from the telegraph to the hoof prints. He listened without interrupting, just chewing on a strip of tobacco like it held the truth. When I finished, he spat into the dirt and said, "You done right, Ellis. I'll take it from here." But I'd heard that tone before. The kind that means a man will ride back east with his paperwork tidy and leave the ghosts to finish their quarrels alone. I nodded anyway. They took Wallace's body from where Thomas had laid it under a tarp behind the barn. Lillian stayed inside, but I could hear her crying softly through the open window as the marshal covered the man with a blanket. Death sits heavy no matter who it claims, and she had seen enough of it for one lifetime. After they rode out, silence settled over the ranch again. It was a different kind this time. Not peace, not even quiet, just a long pause before something breaks. That evening, as the sun bled itself out across the horizon, I saddled my horse and told Thomas I'd ride the perimeter once more. He didn't ask questions. He knew what it meant. Some rides are not about fences or cattle. They're about making sure you can look the night in the eye and not blink first. I took the trail west, past the dry creek bed, past the stand of cottonwoods that still bore scars from lightning. The land smelled of sage and iron and the faint memory of rain. I rode slow, letting the horse find his own pace, letting my mind wander where it needed to. I thought about the war again, about the noise, the fire, the way men stopped being men and turned into something the earth didn't quite recognize. Tanner had that look about him, not evil, just hollow, like whatever had once been human had been burned clean out, leaving only smoke and temper behind. I knew it because I'd worn that same look once. When I got back, the lamps in the house were still burning. Through the window I saw Lillian at the table writing. I dismounted, tied my horse to the rail, and stepped inside. She looked up startled, then smiled faintly. "I'm making a list," she said. "Of what?" "Things worth staying for." That stopped me cold. "How many you got so far?" "3," she said, and tapped the paper with her pencil. The sound of rain on the porch roof. Coffee at dawn, and... She hesitated, then met my eyes. And someone who rides toward cries instead of away from them. I felt something shift inside me, slow and quiet, like thawed ice giving way to water. I wasn't sure what to do with it, so I poured coffee instead. We sat like that a long while, the night stretching easy around us. Words weren't needed. Sometimes the best kind of talking is the kind that never starts. Later, after she'd gone to her room, I stepped outside again. The wind had died, and the stars looked close enough to touch. I thought about her list, about staying, and wondered if I belonged on it. I'd spent so long learning how to leave, I wasn't sure I remembered how to remain. The dog barked once, sharp, then again. I froze. Out beyond the barn, something moved. A glint of metal catching moonlight, a shape slipping between shadows. My hand went to the rifle before my thoughts caught up. I moved quiet, boots sinking into the soft dust. The smell of horses, sweat, and blood still hung around from the fight before. The barn door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, the air was heavy, still. Then I heard it, the sound of a boot scraping wood, soft but sure. "Tanner," I said into the dark. He stepped out from behind a stall, hat low, eyes like gunmetal. He looked thinner, older, and meaner than he had 2 nights ago. His arm was in a sling, but the other hand held a pistol steady. "You killed my brother," he said. "You threw a woman into a canyon," I answered. "Doesn't change what you took from me. Neither does what you did." He smiled then, that small, cracked smile men wear when they've already decided how the night will end. Maybe not, but it evens the board. The gun flashed once. I felt the air move beside my ear, heard the splinter of wood behind me. I dropped low, fired from the hip. the barn filled with smoke and the sound of thunder trapped in walls. Tanner stumbled, caught himself, fired again. It was quick, messy, honest. When the noise cleared, he was on the ground, his gun arm limp, breath coming shallow. I walked over, keeping my rifle ready. "You could have ridden on," I said. He coughed, a dry, bitter sound, and let a schoolmarm live to tell the tale. "Yeah," I said, "that would have been the better lesson." He tried to laugh, but it came out as blood. His eyes met mine one last time, something almost human flickering there. Regret, or maybe just exhaustion. Then it was gone. I stood there a long moment, the smoke settling around us, the barn silent except for the slow creak of the rafters. Outside a breeze picked up, carrying the smell of gunpowder and hay into the open dark. When I stepped back into the yard, Lillian was there, barefoot, lantern trembling in her hands again. She looked past me at the barn, then back at my face. "It's over," I said. She nodded, though her eyes said she understood the lie. Things like that are never over. They just stop bleeding for a while. We buried Tanner at dawn, up on the ridge where the wind keeps the grass bowed low. No words were spoken. The land doesn't need them. It takes what it's given and keeps its own counsel. As we stood there, the sun broke the horizon, light catching on her hair. She looked tired, but alive, and that felt like enough. I took off my hat, held it to my chest, and thought maybe the wind could carry what I couldn't say. When we walked back to the house, she fell in step beside me. Neither of us spoke. The day was new again, and though it carried ghosts, it also carried the faintest shape of peace, the kind a man doesn't look for, only recognizes when it finally sits beside him. The morning after the burial stretched long and hollow. The air had that clean, aching quiet that comes when violence has finally burned itself out. Even the horses seemed to sense it. They moved slower, heads low, as if the ground itself had turned solemn. I took to the porch before sunrise, coffee steaming in my hand, the boards cool beneath my boots. The horizon glowed faint, pink bleeding into gray. I'd seen hundreds of mornings like that, but this one felt heavier, like the world was still deciding if it wanted to start over. Inside, I could hear Margaret humming a hymn, the kind that turns grief into work and work into peace. Lillian was awake too. Her footsteps moved careful, no longer limping, but still with that pause at each turn, as if the floor might remember what fear felt like. When she stepped onto the porch, she wore no shawl this time. The morning light caught in her hair, and the wind played with the ends of it. She looked stronger than she had since the night I'd found her, though there was a quiet in her eyes that wasn't going anywhere soon. "You didn't sleep," she said. "Didn't need to," I answered. "Aim sleep's a thing that visits when it's ready." She smiled, small and real. "I used to believe peace meant never being afraid again. Now I think it just means learning to walk with the fear." I nodded. That's closer to the truth than most folks ever get. We sat in silence after that, listening to the windmill creak and the cattle shuffle in the distance. A hawk called somewhere high and lonely. I could feel the day building, slow and sure, like a fire catching coals. Thomas rode out to town before noon to speak with the marshal and settle what needed settling. Margaret stayed busy in the kitchen, baking more than anyone could eat. That's how she healed. Flour, fire, and patience. I mended a gate that didn't need mending, just to keep my hands honest. Lillian found me there, the hammer half raised, sweat on my brow. "You fix things that aren't broken," she said, almost teasing. "Sometimes a man just needs to hear the sound of something being set right," I said. She watched me for a moment, then took the hammer from my hand. Her fingers brushed mine, brief, electric. She set it down on the post. "Maybe it's not the gate that needed fixin'." That made me laugh, soft and low. "You always talk like that?" "Only when someone's listening," she said. And there was that smile again, quiet, steady, and alive. Later, after supper, we walked down to the creek. The air was thick with the hum of crickets, and the moon floated bright above the cottonwoods. The water caught its reflection, breaking it into trembling pieces. Lillian knelt by the bank, fingertips grazing the surface. "When I was little," she said, "I used to think water remembered every place it passed, every town, every voice, every promise. My mother said that's foolish, that it just runs until it's gone. But I still like the thought of it remembering." I crouched beside her. "The land remembers, too. It keeps the hoofprints and the blood and the laughter. It don't tell, but it remembers." She looked at me, the moonlight soft on her face. "What do you think it remembers about you, Ethan?" That one stopped me. I thought about the things I'd done, the war, the long years after, the men I'd failed, the ones I hadn't. I stared at the dark water. "Probably that I kept leaving," I said finally, "and maybe that I stayed once." She was quiet a long time, just listening to the creek. Then she said, "You don't have to keep leaving anymore." Her words settled between us like dust after a storm. Slow, inevitable, final. We sat there until the night cooled enough to make us shiver. The stars above were thick, sharp, endless. I remember thinking how strange it was. That peace didn't arrive like thunder or revelation. It just sat down beside you when you'd finally stopped expecting it. When we walked back to the house, the lantern in the window was still burning. Margaret always left one lit for whoever might be late returning. Not out of worry, just faith. At the porch steps, Lillian paused. "You ever think you were meant to find me?" she asked. I thought about it. "No," I said, "but I think maybe we were both meant to stop running long enough to be found." She nodded, a tear slipping quick down her cheek before she brushed it away. Then she smiled through it. The kind of smile that means something is healed, even if you don't yet know what. Inside the house was warm. I banked the fire, then sat a while at the table after everyone had gone to bed. The clock ticked slow, steady, the way time does when it's forgiving you. I poured myself one last cup of coffee and looked out the window toward the ridge. The moon sat high above it, calm and whole. Somewhere up there was a grave, and beside it, a lesson. That mercy can live even after bullets, and sometimes that's the best a man can ask for. I thought about how I'd always been good at endings, riding off, fading quiet into horizon dust, but sitting there in that still kitchen, I realized maybe I wasn't done yet. Maybe this wasn't an ending at all. Maybe, for once, it was the beginning. Summer came early that year, dry and impatient. The wind changed, carrying dust instead of rain, and the land started to crack in small, complaining lines. By June, even the shadows looked thirsty. That's the way of it out here. Peace never stays untested for long. The Harrington Ranch kept busy enough. Thomas took on new hands, boys too young to remember the war, full of talk and sunburn. Margaret's garden fought hard against the heat, and somehow it bloomed anyway. Stubborn little miracles growing out of baked earth. As for me, I stayed. I didn't plan it, didn't say the words. I just woke up one morning and realized I hadn't packed to leave. My saddle sat by the door, oiled and ready, but every dawn I found a new reason not to use it. Lillian started teaching again, not in a schoolhouse, but under the cottonwoods by the creek. Ranch hands' kids, drifters, a few from nearby spreads. She painted letters on rough planks and leaned them against tree trunks. I'd ride by some afternoons and hear her voice lifting over the sound of the water, soft but certain, shaping the alphabet into hope. One day, I stopped to watch. The kids were bent over slates, tongues poking out in concentration. She caught me standing there, half hidden behind a cedar, and smiled like she'd been expecting me all along. "You can come closer, Mr. Ellis," she called. "I don't bite." I grinned despite myself and walked up slow, hat in hand. Didn't want to disturb the class. "Well, you already have," she said, eyes teasing. "Might as well make yourself useful. Can you spell river?" "Could spell it once," I said. "Now I mostly just cross 'em." The children laughed. That easy, high sound the world needs more of. She laughed too, and it loosened something inside me I didn't know was still tied. After class, we sat by the creek, her books stacked neatly beside her. The late light was soft, gold sifted through dust. "Never thought I'd see you teaching again," I said. "I didn't think I'd see me living again," she answered, "but here we are." She reached into her satchel and pulled out a small journal, pages rough and thumb-stained. "I've been writing it down," she said. "Everything that happened, everything I don't want to forget." I nodded, watching the pages flutter in the wind. "That's good. Some things deserve witnesses, even if they're only words." She looked at me for a long moment. "And what about you, Ethan? What do you write?" "Nothing," I said. "The things worth remembering don't need paper. They just stay." Her eyes softened. "Maybe so, but words can outlast silence." She was right, of course, but I'd lived too long with silence to let go of it easy. That night, a storm built far off. We could see the lightning roll over the desert, a silent flicker on the horizon. It never reached us, but it painted the sky in brief, fierce flashes, reminders that beauty and danger often travel together. We sat on the porch, the two of us, listening to the faraway thunder. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, face turned toward the light. "Does it ever stop feeling like waiting?" she asked. "What do you mean?" "Waiting for something bad to return, waiting for the peace to break." I thought about it. "No," I said, "but you get better at living anyway." She smiled faintly, then turned to me. "You make it sound simple." "It ain't," I said, my real, "but it's honest." The thunder rolled again, softer now, more memory than warning. She rested her chin in her hand. "Sometimes, when I look at you, I think the land made you just to prove it could be kind and cruel at the same time." I laughed quietly. "That sounds like an accusation." "Maybe it's gratitude," she said, "or maybe both." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of what had been, what hadn't, and what might still be. When she finally stood, she touched my shoulder lightly. "Good night, Ethan." Her hand lingered just long enough for me to feel the weight of it, and then she was gone, her footsteps fading into the house. I sat there a while longer, watching the storm fade. The air smelled of dust and faraway rain. I thought about her words: waiting, peace, kindness, cruelty, and how the West held all of them without apology. A coyote called out from the hills, long and lonely, and I answered in my head, I know, friend, I know. That night, I dreamed of a quiet cabin, not the one in Rattlesnake Canyon, but one smaller, built with 2 sets of hands. In the dream, there was laughter inside, the kind that comes from tired people who have earned it. And for once, I wasn't outside looking in. I was home. When I woke before dawn, the dream clung to me like smoke. I went out to the porch and looked toward the creek. A thin mist lay across the grass, turning the world soft. From somewhere down there, I heard her voice, faint, humming a tune the West hadn't learned to forget yet. And I thought, maybe that's all peace really is. A voice in the morning and a reason to listen. By the middle of July, the world had turned to brass and fire. Dust sat on everything like it meant to stay. On the window glass, the porch rail, the cattle's backs, even the coffee that steamed between my fingers each dawn. The air shimmered with heat you could taste. It was the kind of season that peels the weak off the land and leaves the rest harder, quieter. The ranch held on. We all did. Thomas woke earlier, worked slower. Margaret kept her kitchen cool with damp burlap hung in the doorway and a pitcher of well water close at hand. Lillian wore a straw hat too big for her, riding out to her little school by the creek each morning, dust trailing behind like a train of ghosts. I rode beside her sometimes, though I didn't say it was because I wanted to. I tell myself I was checking the herd or the fence or the weather, whatever excuse a man can make when his heart is already decided for him. She'd catch me now and then watching her and pretend not to notice. That small grace of hers saved me more than once. One evening, after the heat had broken enough to breathe again, I was fixing a loose shutter on the porch when she came out carrying 2 cups of coffee. The light was low, soft amber spilling across her face. I thought you might need this, she said. I always do, I answered, taking the cup. She leaned against the rail beside me, eyes on the far horizon. The sky was pink at the edges, gold in the middle, blue where it met the earth. It looked like a painting no one could finish. Do you ever miss it? She asked. What's that? The war, the noise, the purpose. I took a slow sip, the coffee bitter and good. You don't miss war. You miss the man you thought you were before it started. She nodded quiet. And who were you before? Someone who believed right and wrong were different colors, I said. Turns out they share a border that keeps shifting in the dark. She turned toward me, the wind lifting a strand of her hair. You speak like someone who's been alone too long. Maybe, I said, but alone's easier to keep honest. Her gaze softened. You don't have to stay that way. There it was again, her way of saying something simple and making it sound like a door opening. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The sound of crickets rose up, steady and patient, filling the silence between us. She set her cup down on the railing. I've been thinking, she said, about the children, about building a real schoolhouse, something that lasts longer than summer. That'd be a fine thing, I said. I can't do it alone. I met her eyes, and she held my stare without flinching. I wasn't asking you to, I said. Her smile came slow, like dawn after too long a night. Then it settled. We spent the next week working side by side. Thomas lent us some of the men when chores allowed. and before long a frame began to rise from the dirt near the creek. Each hammer stroke sounded like a promise, small, steady, believable. The smell of cut pine and sweat filled the air. Lillian read from her book of Psalms while she painted the boards, her voice light but sure. Sometimes I'd stop working just to listen, the rhythm of her words blending with the sound of the hammer and the wind. Out here, prayers and labor are close cousins. One evening, when the last beam was set and the light turned to honey-colored, we stood back to look at what we made. The roof caught the sun just right, shining like it meant it. She wiped her brow, leaving a streak of paint across her cheek. I reached to brush it away, but stopped halfway, hand hanging between us. Her eyes met mine, steady, knowing. "Go on," she said, barely above a whisper. I touched her cheek, thumb catching the warmth of her skin. It wasn't a grand thing, just real. The kind of touch that doesn't ask, doesn't explain. She didn't move away. For a long moment there was nothing but the wind, the smell of pine, and the quiet pulse of two hearts remembering how to trust the same silence. Then she smiled. A slow, sure smile that felt like the West itself finally forgiving something. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat out by the half-built schoolhouse, listening to the creek and the whisper of the wind through unfinished walls. The moon hung above, clean and merciless. I thought about her hand in mine, the small tremor of it, and the strange calm that followed. A coyote called from the ridge. Somewhere behind me, a door creaked open. Her footsteps were soft on the dry grass. She didn't say anything at first, just sat beside me. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked. "No," she said. "I kept hearing the nails settle in the wood, like the house was finding its breath." "That's a good sound," I said. "Yes," she whispered. "It sounds like staying." We sat there until dawn began to stretch its fingers over the land. The first light caught her face, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't think about what I'd lost. I thought about what I'd found. And when the sun finally rose, the new schoolhouse stood bright and clean in its light. The door still without hinges, the windows still without glass, but ready and waiting, alive, and so were we. The morning the schoolhouse opened, the air was cool enough to remember spring. Mist rolled off the creek, thin and silver, curling around the posts like smoke that didn't know where to settle. I saddled the horses early and rode down before the others just to see it standing there alone in the first light. It wasn't much. A single room, pine walls pale and raw, a bell strung from a wagon rim, benches built from leftover fence planks. But it looked right. It looked earned. You could smell the cut wood and the hope still drying in the paint. Lillian came walking up the trail not long after, a basket on her arm, her skirt brushing the grass, still wet with dew. She paused beside me, her breath showing in the chill. "You came early," she said. "Old habit," I answered. "I like to make sure the world's still here before I trust it with children." She laughed softly and pushed open the door. The sound of it creaked, honest and welcoming. Inside she began setting out her books, arranging chalk and slates, her movements careful and steady like a prayer she'd said 1,000 times before. Watching her there, I realized something simple and dangerous, the kind of peace I'd spent half my life running from, had found me without asking permission. When the children arrived, a handful at first, then more, dusty and shy, she greeted each by name, her voice smooth as morning coffee. Their laughter filled the room, bouncing off those bare walls, filling all the cracks silence had left behind. I stayed outside, leaning against the rail. The sound of her reading drifted through the open window. Words about rivers and light and beginnings. Every word settled in me like rain on burned soil. Around noon, she stepped out with a tin cup of water and a smile that knew exactly what it was doing to me. "You could come in, you know," she said. "Why not? You don't always have to guard the door." "Somebody's got to," I said. "Maybe," she replied, "but not always you." She was right, though it took me a long moment to admit it. I finally set my hat on the post and followed her inside. The air was warm, thick with chalk dust and sunlight. She pointed to the empty chair in the back, the one I'd built but never planned to sit in. "Lessons about stories today," she said, handing me a book. "You might have one worth telling." I looked down at the pages. They smelled of paper and ink and second chances. "Maybe someday," I said, "Ma, but not yet." She smiled and went back to her work. I sat there watching her, listening to the rhythm of her voice weaving itself through the laughter of the children. The sound of it filled the room like wind through wheat, simple, endless, alive. When class ended, the children scattered into the field, their voices trailing off into the bright day. She stayed behind, erasing the board, humming that same tune I'd first heard the morning after the canyon. I walked to the doorway, leaned there, and said, "You've made something good here." She turned, chalk dust on her fingers, sunlight in her hair. "We have," she said, "both of us." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and far-off rain. I stepped closer, and she didn't move away. The space between us closed without ceremony, the way seasons turn when no one's keeping count. Her hand found mine. The touch was quiet, but sure, like the land itself approving. "I used to think I'd die out here," I said, "that this country was only meant for ghosts and men too stubborn to join them." "And now?" she asked. "Now I think maybe it was waiting for me to live." She smiled, slow and steady. "Then let's live." We stood there for a long time. The door opened behind us, the sound of the creek steady in the distance. The sky was wide and clean, and the land stretched out ahead like a promise it might actually keep. I don't remember what we said after that, or if we said anything at all. Words have a way of falling short when a moment finally fits, but I remember the feel of her hand in mine, the weight of the sun on our backs, the quiet hum of a world that had finally stopped fighting itself. And in that stillness, somewhere between dust and grace, I knew the truth I've been riding toward all along. A man can be lost and still be found. He can be broken and still be whole. He can ride through darkness and come out carrying light. That isn't his alone. I used to think the West was about surviving. Now I know it's about belonging. And sometimes, if you're lucky, it gives you someone to belong to. Ethan Ellis, AN 76, Rattlesnake Canyon.